so we say of a thing that we consider bad, it has no future. Well, nothing has a future. There isn't a future. There's always a present, and one has to get this as a kind of a basic approach. So then, one can also, therefore, use the word play or game in a sense that is not trivial. We don't think, for example, that when we hear a performance of a Bach cantata, or better, a purely non-symbolic thing, like a fugue, we don't think that that's trivial. We don't think it's trivial to play the organ in church. We don't think that the plays of Shakespeare are trivial. They're plays. A play, you see, in the sense that I'm using it, is a musical thing. It is a dance. It is an expression of delight in the sense of Blake saying that energy is eternal delight. And, for example, the art of Islam, the arabesques, which aren't pictures of anything. They're just fantastically intricate, beautifully colorful designs. They are play. And according to this thesis, the universe is just like that. It is a very, very elaborate play system. And the fundamental elements of this play, the Chinese call the yang and the yin. Yang means the positive and yin the negative. Yang refers to the south side of a mountain, which is in the sun, and yin to the north side, which is in the shade. Yang refers to the north bank of a river, which is in the sun, and yin to the south bank of a river, which is in the shade. Yang is symbolically or prototypically male, yin is symbolically female. That's not to cast any reflections on women. So you might say the reason they're called male and female is that yang is aggressive and yin is yielding. Yang is convex, yin is concave. Now, the secret about the opposites, which is as important as realizing that there is no such thing as time. The secret about the opposites is this, that they appear to be as different can be. We say of opposites, like black and white, that they are the poles apart. But in using that phrase, poles, you imply a connection between them. As there is a connection of the north to the south pole of the earth, and as there is a connection between the north and south poles of a magnet. They are two ends of the same stick, two sides of the same coin, two opposite points on the same sphere. And that means that they go together. In Chinese, this is called arising mutually. As in the second chapter of Lao Tzu, where he says, when all the world knows beauty to be beautiful, there is already ugliness. When all the world knows goodness to be good, there is already evil. For to be and not to be arise mutually. What confuses people is that they don't see this. They think, for example, that the positive is something there which truly exists, whereas the negative has less reality. It doesn't exist. We think that, for example, the space in which this universe floats is a non-entity and has no importance. And we are thereby, because we see energy manifested in the positive aspect of things, and no energy manifested in the negative, we are afraid that energy and its delight is threatened by nothingness. That it's going to be swallowed up and that in the end, darkness will win. We feel that about ourselves, and we feel it about the universe as a whole. Because energy is effort. And effort, after a while, you get tired and you can't keep it up. And so darkness must win. According to Chinese philosophy, that is a hallucination. Because energy cannot be manifested without inertia. There must be something to push against for there to be any manifestation of energy. You cannot dance without a floor to use your energy against. You cannot, when energy or any kind of motion is completely unobstructed, there's a sort of squish, a fizzle, and nothing happens. Because fundamentally, as we shall see next hour, motion is only realized when there is stillness, relative stillness. And so energy is only realized when there is inertia, and the positive is only realized when there is the negative to bring it out. These things work together, but when you don't realize it, you are anxious. You are afraid that the dark side is going to win. Now, the minute that happens, you become unable to play. You start getting serious, and the game degenerates into a fight. Because you feel it absolutely urgent and necessary under those circumstances that the positive must be made to win, accentuate the positive, you see. And that leads to all this beastly kind of religion, where people go around with forced smiles and hearty handshakes and accentuate the positive. And the moment a person does that, you know that it's a big fake, it's a put-on, and that there's something utterly unreal about it. That's why you may have often experienced the fact that certain kinds of virtuous people are offensively virtuous. And they're very difficult to get on with. They don't have any light touch. And of course, this is particularly prevalent in religions. Because not all religions, but many religions are states of terror about the negative side. I was talking with a very enlightened nun the other day, Catholic, and she was open to all sorts of new ideas. And I said, you know, there's one thing wrong with your worship, and the way you sing your hymns and chant your chants and do all these rituals. You don't swing. I don't mean by that it isn't syncopated. I mean by that there is not an attitude of delight about it. It's always you feel the service is being conducted in the presence of the chief inspector of morals. The original stuffed shirt, the appalling grandfather, in whose presence you daren't show any kind of sprightliness, because after all, you know, when we are children and we are very exuberant and we leap around and bounce and all over the place, we make the adults tired. Because the moment a child starts getting exuberant, we try to give him a guilty conscience. You have no business having so much fun. There are other people in the world who hurt. There are people who are starving. There are people who suffer. And for you to go around leaping around as if the whole thing was gorgeous is a kind of irreverence. So be guilty. Shut up. So as a result of that, where we think that an occasion is of particular solemnity, where you're in church or in court or standing in a row of Marines or something saluting the flag, everybody gets grim. And so there is no delight in religion of that kind. Well, there's none agreed with me that they really ought to do something about that. And I said, well, maybe I'll come to your convent and teach you how to sing. But you see, all of that is because of the fear that the nothing will win over the something. Now, it's true in games, there is a winner and there is a loser. But in a fight, it's different. In a fight, the object of victory is to get rid of the defeated party. Because he's bad, and he ought not to be there at all. But in a game, it's quite different. Because if there is to be a winner, there has to be a loser. So it's terribly important not to get rid of the opponent. You could have no chess unless you had the black side as well as the white. Impossible. So in a game, what we admire a person we call a good loser. That is to say, a good sport. Because he does not take the loss seriously. It's very instructive, for example, to play any game that you know well, whether it's chess or checkers or whatever, with yourself. And each time you move over to the opposite side, play it with your best skill. For example, you can play a very marvelous game. You take two cocktail olive toothpicks, you know, the kind they make into little plastic swords, and you do a fencing match with yourself. And actually try to stick one of your hands, and the other hand really tries to defend itself. You'll find this is extremely interesting. It's a meditation exercise. And then you realize, you see, what is the nature of a game. Because if you are a good chess player, you may congratulate yourself if your opponent wins, if you have given him a good contest. Because then the game as such was interesting. And you come to realize that you and your opponent in a game of chess together constitute a single organism, like your right hand and your left hand fencing with each other. Let not your left hand know what your right hand doeth. That means have a conspiracy to pretend that they don't belong to one organism and that they're different, like black and white, like space and solid. They must look as different as possible. But underneath, in order that there be a game, in order that there be, in other words, a relationship of these two, there has to be a secret agreement. They have to be tacitly one, but openly two, exoterically two, esoterically one. Because, you see, on the stage, when you get the hero and the villain, they are really friends behind the scenes because they belong to the same company of actors. But this mustn't be admitted on the stage because that would give the show away. Now you see, it's true, we mustn't give the show away. That's why there are esoteric teachings. But on the other hand, there is another opposite extreme, which is not realizing that the show is a show. And that's as bad as giving the show away. So you have always, when you are in the theater, say you go to the movies, and you go to see some great horror movie, you know, awful thing. Well, why does one do it? You want a thrill. And the whole of the universe wants a thrill. That's what it's all about. Otherwise it would be boring. But when you go to the movie, you know in your heart of hearts that it's only a movie. And yet you contrive to some degree to forget this while you're there, and therefore get scared and feel real creeps. But that's great. Some people like to go and cry. They go and see some tragedy and just love to weep because it's a catharsis. It gets all the salt out of you or something, I don't know. And so you do this thing. And it is, we can say it's vicarious. Yeah. But that is the spirit of showmanship, of play. So one might say then that it is possible in this life to attain a sort of metaphysical courage in which you really know deep within that the most harrowing experiences that physical existence can offer are a show. Now this is the, what you might call ultimate nerve. And for example, when the samurai in Japan studied Zen, that's what they wanted to get from it. They wanted to get ultimate nerve so that absolutely nothing would faze them. So there is a poem which says, "Under the sword lifted high, there is hell making you tremble. But go ahead, and there is the land of bliss." Don't hesitate, see? Don't be blocked. Don't be fazed, nonplussed by the illusion. Now you would say, well, that's all very well, but I can't bring myself to that. I start to shake and I can't stop it. It's not to do with my will. And no amount of gritting my teeth, clenching my muscles, exercising my willpower can get rid of the shakes when I am really scared. That's true. But you must remember that the secret to all this is not to be afraid of fear. When you can really allow yourself to be afraid, and you don't resist the experience of fear, you are truly beginning to master fear. But when you refuse to be afraid, you are resisting fear. And that simply sets up a vicious circle of being afraid of fear and being afraid of being afraid of fear, and so on. And that's what we call worry. Worry is simply a chronic condition. And people who worry are going to worry no matter what happens. Because when one possible threat is exterminated, they will immediately discover another. Because worry is an infinitely skinned onion. And you can go on and on and on, because the moment you see, you can reduce the size of the onion and you get your worry down to about this, suddenly your whole sense of distance and size changes. And because you're looking so intently at this little onion, it fills your whole field of vision and is once again a big onion. See? You start peeling that down. But as you get another one about this size, then it enlarges itself in your judgment and your sense of values. And once more, it's colossal. Now, that's always going on. So if you are disposed to worry, there is always plenty to worry about. You make plenty of money and you have no troubles about that, then you start wondering if you're going to get a disease. And the doctor says, no, it's all right, you've nothing wrong with you. Then you wonder if you're going to get into an accident. And then you take precautions, and then you wonder if there's going to be a political revolution, etc. Whether your house is going to be robbed. There's always something. So it is really, this kind of worrying is a completely useless pursuit. And yet, we feel a little guilty if we don't do it. Because it's somehow put into us that a proper amount of worrying is showing a good sense of responsibility. You're concerned. And Paul Tillich used this word concern in a special way. And Quakers always use the word concerned. And all people, you might say, who are socially conscious are concerned. So when we say I'm concerned, it means I have a frown on my face. And I'm worried about you, about the nation, about the war, so on, concerned. And Tillich said, religion is ultimate concern. I am concerned about the universe. And he used this wonderful decontaminated word for God, which he got from Eckhart, the ground of being. See, God still has whiskers on it, but the ground of being doesn't, obviously. And so, ultimate concern is to be concerned about the ground of being. Well, now, I don't think I'm not sure about Tillich. I knew him, and he was a very wonderful man. But what I call concern, the way I would want to interpret it, instead of this sort of frown, is something more like amazement. In other words, that existence is extremely peculiar. I can't explain this feeling because I don't know quite how to ask a question about existence so that I could be said to be wondering about it in some sort of clear-thinking way. It's a very nice thing to consider to yourself, that if you were going to have an interview with the Lord God, and you would have only 5 minutes, and you might ask one question, what would you ask? And you've got plenty of time to think this over in advance. And you realize, question after question, say, no, that's not really the thing I want to get at. It's not that. Like, do you exist? God would say, well, of course. Yes, here I am. Am I having a hallucination? He said, no. Well, how can I be sure that this isn't a hallucination, you see? And then you reject all that sort of question. And when you finally come down to it, you don't know what to ask. There is a sort of question in your mind, not so much a question as a questioning. A feeling of, it's all unbelievable. It's amazing. I wonder at it. I marvel at it. It is a miracle that there is anything. But it's like a friend of mine who went to a Zen master, got an interview after pretty trouble, an interpreter. And he sat down and said, you know, now I'm here, I don't know what to ask. I just feel like laughing. And Zen master said, well, let's laugh. And they just broke up. So, but that feeling, you see, of the marvelousness of being is what I call, or would want to mean by Tillich's phrase, ultimate concern. It's also love is involved in it. See, that's the part of the problem of an abstractionist culture such as ours. As I indicated, we are not materialists, we are abstractionists. A materialist is a lover, and therefore is somebody related to the present. Because, you see, you can't love except in the present. When you have under your hands a piece of wood, and you say, my, hasn't that a gorgeous grain, you know, and you fondle it. If it moves, fondle it. And you run over this and think, gee, isn't that gorgeous, you see? Well, you're loving it. It may be that it's an apple in your hand, and you say, I love you so much I could eat you. And you eat it, and you relish it. That's loving in a special way. So concern and love And there are many forms of love. There's a whole spectrum of different kinds of love, which runs from the red of libido to the violet of divine charity. But all of them are equally important because, as you know, you can't have the violet end without the red end, and vice versa. You wouldn't know what violet was unless you had all the other colors. The colors create each other. So it isn't simply black and white. Between black and white is the spectrum. And just as black and white arise mutually, so you know red in relation to yellow, in relation to green, in relation to blue, and so on. But they all come out of black and white. That's the secret. I think Mr. Lamb, who invented a camera, made a rather spectacular demonstration of this. So, if then you try to obliterate fear, the fear that black may win, you're working in the wrong way. To attack a fear is to strengthen it. Because immediately you feel guilty if you don't succeed, or you feel inadequate. But fear is something that arises naturally and spontaneously under certain circumstances, just as you will feel warm if you get near a fire. And you can't go up to a fire without some sort of self-hypnosis and then say, well, I refuse to be warm. There's something a bit weird about that. Besides, you often want to feel warm when you get near a fire. No, on the contrary, it is very natural to be afraid. And so if you don't try to knock it down, you don't try to make yourself over into some sort of preconceived idea of what you ought to be, then you're on the track. Now, when you think, for example, that I ought to change myself into something different, but what is the agency which will effect this change? Well, we could say two things. On the one hand, it's the same self that you want to change. So how can it change it? Or on the other hand, you could say that the idea that there is a sort of separate ego in you which can go to work on the rest of you is a hallucination. And that's why gurus and teachers set their students weird tasks. They may discover that the dissociated ego is indeed a hallucination. Now, for example, one of the ones that is commonly used is to get yourself a pure mind. And that means you control your thoughts and emotions. You mustn't have any violent or hateful emotions. You mustn't hate anyone. You mustn't have any sexy emotions. All pure ideas. Clean up. You know what happens? So many, in the parent-child relationship, many parents can't stand their children. They're a nuisance. They're the result of bad rubber goods, and they didn't mean to have them anyway. And they're expensive and noisy, and they've disturbed the peace of the place, and they detest them. But you cannot admit in this culture that you detest your child. That's the most awful thing. But you see, what happens if you don't admit it is that whereas outwardly you go through the motions of being loving and beautiful, You don't smell right, and the child gets it. The child knows intuitively and inwardly that there's a crossed up message here. It says love, but it acts hate. Vice versa. A lot of children hate their mothers, hate their fathers. That's supposed to be very bad. And the whole pandemonium that's going on these days is largely due to that, but nobody can come out and be honest about it. So now control your thoughts. Watch that hate. The moment it arises, doing. Knock it down. Well, now you know the guru who's teaching you all this. You've projected quite a bit on him. The fact that you accepted a guru at all shows that you have endowed another person with much greater wisdom than yourself. That's your opinion, incidentally. And therefore, people invariably attribute to gurus all kinds of astounding powers, especially of a telepathic nature. And indeed, a good guru is a very sensitive fellow and can tell by people's eyes and gestures and tone of voice all sorts of things about them, as can any experienced psychologist. But you see, when you are trying to control your thoughts, and you know you have some kind of wrong thought, you project upon the guru to recognize it instantly. He reads you. He sees right through you. And therefore you know that he almost must look at you as a terrible worm. Because you can never quite succeed at doing it, you see. And the lesson of this is, you see, the whole point of this lesson is to discover that the alleged you, which is different from your thoughts and feelings, is a hallucination. There is a stream of thought and feeling going on, just like there is a stream of water going by, and that's you. It's an organized stream, just in the same way that when you see a whirlpool in a river, it's organized, it's recognizable, it has a shape, and it has an enduring shape, even though it is a constant flow. Or take a better illustration still, a flame on a candle. It is a stream of gas. And no particle of this gas stays in the flame for but a split second. But the flame keeps apparently there and is recognizable. I can say 1, 2, 3 flames, this one, that one, t'other one. And that's like us. But that stream, which we are, there is thought, feeling, what we call the body, everything like that. But the body is one of the most intangible things there is. You seem to be able to grab hold of it. But it is nothing more than a vibrating pattern of energy. And on it flows. So when you understand that, you can see a little bit more why Hindus speak of the body as Maya, as illusion. Because one of the things they mean by illusion is transitoriness as distinct from permanence. That is to say, everything in this world is disintegrating. In fact, if it weren't, it wouldn't be there. Disintegration is life. And it's as important to see that as it is to see that there is no time and that black and white go together. Because to the extent that you see it is disintegrating and that there's no way of stopping this, you can get into a frame of mind where you get with it, where you, as it were, give up and fall apart along with everything else. Now you might think, you see, again, in our general Western frame of mind, we would think, well, that's just giving up. That's spineless. That's cowardice. That's awful. And anybody who would just give up like that would be expected to become a slob. But the contrary is true. You see, in all what you might call the dynamics of the spiritual life, there are what appear to be many paradoxes. Courses of action which in common sense would lead to one result turn out in fact to lead to an opposite result. So you would think that a child who admits to hatred of parents, or vice versa, would act out the hatred, would do something violent. No, it is precisely the one who does not admit it that will act out and who will do something violent. Because like the monk of Siberia who are fasting Ruwiria, the violence will at last burst from its cell. It can't be contained. And I found again and again and again, going around especially in religious circles, where so many people are trying to not admit what they feel, especially Puritans, prudes, very frequently have a strong streak of cruelty. And this, of course, can be a kind of a sexual substitute, a sadistic or masochistic thing. That is simply because they don't admit to having a negative side. And so the negative side will express itself in a violent way. People who are always doing things for other people's good will be liable to bomb them for their benefit. And utterly destroy them in the name of goodness. And this is because such people are not ever going to be good soldiers. I was talking a few weeks ago to the Air Force Weapons Research Lab at Kirtland, near Albuquerque. And I was somewhat surprised to be invited to this sinister institution. But it was full of extremely brilliant people. Fantastic minds. And so naturally we got onto the subject of strategy. Because military strategy is a very, very interesting thing. It contains all the basic life problems. And I said to them when I started out, I said, now, you have asked me to tell you as a philosopher, what are my basic premises for moral behavior? Well, I said they are total selfishness. I'm not going to beat around the bush with you people. I'm going to be sentimental or anything like that, because you're dealing with military methods, where you have to be tough, and where you have to be so tough that you've no time for finer feelings. So let's begin that way. Now, I said you might imagine, therefore, that if I based my behavior on total selfishness, that I would go around being rude to people and aggressive and pushing through and so on, but I said I don't, because I found it doesn't work. People put up resistance, they get obstreperous, and I don't win them over. So my self-interest is better conserved by putting on a pretense of politeness and that I really am concerned about you all and so on. But I said I am not. This is just a big act. Now, and I said the next thing that happens is this. When I decide that I'm going to base everything on total selfishness, I start wondering what I want. Well, so many things that I thought I want, when I got them, I found out I didn't. So I have to go very deeply into the question, what do I really want? What sort of friends do I want? What sort of a house do I want? What sort of a life do I want? What sort of a job do I want to do? And you see, people don't think this through. They get all sorts of ready-made ideas of what they ought to want. Because what education does to us to so large an extent is to fit us into a set of prepared stereotypes. And we never stop to find out what we really want to do. Well, that's one thing. But then something else very odd comes up when I say I'm purely selfish, which is, what is me? And then I come across this curious thing that I don't know who I am unless I know who you are. If I would live without any other people, I don't think I would know I was there. I see myself in terms of others. That is to say, by a social relationship. I am I because you are you. You are you because I am I. But then, there's something that's gone screwy here, something funny about this. Which is, of course, that myself isn't at all what I thought it was. Myself is almost everything else as well as myself. Well, then I really don't know what to do, because there's no point in my thinking anymore that I can just go around attacking people and getting rid of them and so on, and because all I'm doing is a sort of, as if I was hungry and I started chewing on my own toes. Because I discovered that hurting others hurts me. Now, of course, you do have to cut your toenails and take care of your hair and things like that. And there's always some kind of violence is necessary in life, just like you have to kill a fish to eat it, or you have to kill an apple when you chew it. Well, that's sort of like cutting off the toenails and combing your hair and so on, clipping, things like that. And sort of like getting rid of dead skin and the general elimination process. But fundamentally, you see, when you think that there are dreadfully wrong people who ought to be obliterated, or that the world outside you is something that you are in a fight with, well, that's just like a person who is completely insensitive in the middle, so that he doesn't know that his leg end goes with the top end. You know that in worms, if a worm gets damaged, it develops a sort of calloused area in it. And the worm, when it wiggles, the rhythm of the wiggle doesn't pass through the calloused area. It has to wiggle separately on each end. So the worm, instead of going wiggle, 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 goes wiggle, bump, wiggle, bump, wiggle, bump, wiggle. And so a lot of people are like that physically. This is one of the important things that Wilhelm Reich found out, that people tend to have a state of tension in the diaphragm, as a result of which they can't swing. Have you ever tried to teach anybody to dance the hula? Lots of people just cannot bring themselves to make that hip motion. They're too rigid. And they're like the worm with a callus in it. Or then there's another myth about this. You know, there's a famous snake called Ouroboros. And he's always drawn chewing his own tail and eating it. Imagine what happens when the tail gets inside and it gets inside and inside and the whole thing is clutched up, see? And this worm, the snake, is a symbol of what the Buddhists call samsara, that is to say the round or rat race of life and death. And this goes on so long as the worm doesn't know that his tail is himself. When he discovers that, he lets go of it and wiggles happily along like every good snake should. Of course, there is something more to it than that. You might say, well, why in the first place did he not realize that his tail was his own? Well, because he wanted something else. See, there wasn't anything except the snake in the beginning, because the snake is the symbol of God. But in the Upanishads, in the Isha Upanishad, first line of it said that in the beginning there was the one God, the Ishvara. And he said, I'm lonely. And so he made another, which was a woman. And he made love to her. As a result of which all gods were born. But the woman got guilty about this because she felt it was incest. And so she turned herself into a cow. And he became a bull. And he made love to her. And so came all cattle. And the same thing happened. She got guilty and turned herself into a sheep. And he turned himself into a ram. And so on. And by this means the universe was created. So, this is othering. It's called in Christian theology by the Greek word kenosis, which means self-emptying, where God others himself in the sense of getting himself into a position where he forgets he's God, or where he has abrogated omnipotence. Now, in the theory of games, it is absolutely important to abrogate omnipotence. Because you realize that if your knowledge and power was without limit, there were no obstacle to it whatsoever, there would be no way of realizing it. When we know for certain the outcome of a game, we don't play it. We call it off. And we invent a new game in which we don't know the outcome. So power, whether partial power or omnipower, will always be in a state of abrogating itself. So the fundamental game, therefore, the fundamental game form, which is manifested in the yang and the yin, the two opposites, is of course the game of hide and seek. Of remembering and forgetting. You see, really to forget is the opposite of remember, only the word hasn't the same form. We should put remember opposite dismember, because to remember is to put back the members of something that has been dismembered. So when the snake thinks that its tail isn't itself, it is dismembered. When the snake finds that its tail is itself, it's remembered. So that's why the Catholics say the words of Jesus at the Mass, do this in remembrance of me. So that you will discover that you are one body, which is, of course, the only body there is. So lesson number 2 is relativity. Lesson number 1 having been the opposites. In this course on cosmologic or cosmic gamesmanship, we were discussing the fact this morning that any manifestation of energy needs an opposition. In other words, nothing happens. There is no motion, there is no possibility of energy unless there is something opposing it. There is no dancing except on a floor against which you can push and move. And so I pointed out, therefore the sense of self depends entirely on the sensation of there being something other. But that this is a kind of a maya, in other words, the general feeling that one side is definitively split off from and separate from the other is an illusion. But nevertheless, there is the opposition between energy and inertia, motion and stillness, is something that, as it were, is the bifurcation or two aspects of a single process. And you know it's a single process because they can't do without each other. If they could do without each other, then it would be a divided process, radically divided, split down the middle. But as it is, the interdependence of these two sides of things, or two ways of looking at things, shows that there is something in common between the two. And to understand this is the essential key to living in a sane way. Because if you're insane, you're split up. An idiot, you know, the word Greek idiotes means private, purely private, isolated, out of communication, out of relationship. And so this is a way of saying that insanity is a lack of awareness of relativity, because all existence is relationship. Now, if we can take a very fundamental illustration of this, I want you to imagine a universe in which all that there exists is one ball. This ball will, of course, have to be floating in space, because if there is no space outside the ball, nobody knows that it's a ball. There's no possibility of a ball which has no space beyond it, because then the ball itself, the solid material of the ball, would be all that there was, and there would be nothing outside it. So there would be no way of defining it as a ball. So there has to be, our universe, one ball in space, and the space outside the ball, furthermore, must be regarded as depending upon the existence of the ball. The ball and a space go together. Now then, however, there is no way of telling what this ball is doing, whether it's moving or whether it is still. It could be roaring through this space at thousands of miles an hour, and there'd be no way of proving it. There would be no air friction upon it. There would be nothing relatively stable with which its movement could be compared and against which it could be measured. So this ball has no energy. It can't even be said to be still. It can't be said to be in motion. And of course, this is the situation of the universe as a whole. In the beginning, one of the things that God said before the Bible started, the first thing according to the Bible was, "Let there be light." But actually there were several former pronouncements. One of which was, you've got to draw the line somewhere. And the other was, "Have a ball." And this is why most objects of celestial existence are spherical. Don't you think it's very odd to be living on a spherical rock revolving round an enormous spherical fire? It's just weird. Wake up and find yourself in that situation. So, he said, have a ball. Now, this is the fundamental situation. The universe as a whole is presumably some kind of ball. It's curved space, and there it is. And nothing can be said about the whole universe as to whether it is moving or whether it is still. It's neither. That's why the Hindus, in trying to make some indication of the ultimate reality, say it is not this, it is not that. It is not one thing, it's not the other. It doesn't exist, it doesn't not exist. It doesn't both exist and not exist. It doesn't neither exist nor not exist. So you can't say anything about it. Your tongue is tied up. That's why it is said in the Mumonkan, which is a great Zen text, that when you've attained enlightenment, you're like a dumb man who's had a marvelous dream. Everybody who's had a marvelous dream wants to tell everybody about it, but if you're dumb, you can't say a thing. So in the same way, the moment you realize that you are one with all that there is, well, it's this fundamental ball, and you can't say anything about it. Because it isn't moving, it isn't not moving. You can't think about it. And the reason you can't think about it is not because it exceeds you, it's because it is you. You can't get at it like you can't bite your own teeth. So then, if we introduce two balls into our cosmos, then we can say something about motion, because it is apparent that they can approach each other or get away from each other. But no one can say which one is doing it or whether both are doing it, because there is no way of determining it. One may be still and the other moving to it or away from it. Both may be moving towards each other or away from each other, but there is no way of saying which one starts. And furthermore, they can only move with respect to each other in a straight line. They have no possibility of moving on a surface. They have defined linear motion. Now we will introduce three balls into our system, and suddenly we find not only that they can move on a surface with respect to each other, but also that there's going to be a little fight started. Because if two balls stay together at a constant space apart, and one ball appears to approach them or to recede from them, well, here is a problem. Are the two standing still and the one likes them or doesn't like them, so moves closer or away, or is the one standing still and the two moving towards it or away from it? Well, there's only one way in this thing of deciding. Two balls that stay together constitute a majority. And according to the majority vote, they will decide whether they are moving away from the other one or approaching it, or whether it is standing still or whatever. Now then, the third ball, of course, can lick them by joining them. It can always stay, if it wants to, at a constant space from the other two, unless they break up and go off in different directions. So long as they stay together, it can stay with them. And then we are back to the original situation, because no one is moving at all, however much they move. Because the three constitute now one constellation, one triangle. All right, introduce a fourth ball. Now we have the possibility of motion in three dimensions. And you would say, well, now this is good, because we've got an umpire. Somebody who stands at the distance of objectivity and looks down upon those three balls and will decide which of them are moving and which of them are still. Very good, but the problem is, which one of them is the fourth? Who's the umpire? Everyone is in a position of a third dimension to the other three. So everyone is both involved in the game of three and could be the external observer who is the umpire of what the three are doing. Now that is exactly your situation as being, sensing yourself as an external observer of the world. And this is a simple, basic principle in terms of which all bodies in the cosmos may be understood. It's simply nothing but a multiplication of this situation. It's complicated, yes, so that you have to scratch your head to think about it, but it all reduces down to this fundamental mutual motion of balls. So, you see from this, what is the meaning of relativity? So, none of the balls, incidentally, have such a thing as a true position. Because the position of any one of the four is where it seems to be from the different points of view of each member of the group. The members of the group can get together and agree upon a theoretical positioning of the balls, but they can never directly see all of the balls, including the one that's looking, in this theoretical position, just in the same way as you have a theoretical idea of the dimensions of a room, which would correspond to an architect's ground plan and elevation. And you would say you know that that corner up there is a right angle, although you see it as an obtuse angle. Now this agreement as to what are the true positions of things is very important, because upon such agreement depends all possibilities of human communication. We have to have a standard of what is north, south, east, and west, of what is a unit of measure, of what language is, and what words or what noises are to mean what experiences. And by constructing this conventional standard of measures, we are able to agree with each other. But one must see at the same time that this is a convention. There is no reason for driving on the right side of the road rather than the left, except that everybody must agree what side they're going to drive on. One isn't really preferable to the other. The point is to agree. So when we agree about certain social conventions, whether they be legal or moral or descriptional, aesthetic, whatever they are, they are a construct, they are an abstraction. And nobody well, let's say they're an abstraction, and this abstraction is never directly perceived, just as you cannot possibly go up to the ceiling to a position where you can see the whole floor as a rectilinear pattern as it would be drawn in an architect's blueprint. Your vision will always be distorted. If by distortion you mean departure from the blueprint. So then, except in terms of some sort of convention of this kind, there is no such thing as the true position of the four balls in space. Because you must always ask, when you ask about truth, truth for whom? Or truth in relation to what standards? Now you see, when we measure something by inches, inch numbered 1 is the same length as the inch numbered 2, 3, 4, etc. When we measure things by the clock is a circle regularly divided into 360 or multiples thereof degrees. But I've often wondered whether it wouldn't be interesting to have elliptical clocks or May West shaped clocks, so that certain times of the day would go faster than others, or slower than others. It might be very convenient to have the evening to last longer, slow time down for the evening, you see, speed it up at some other time. Why not? But you see, we try to fit everything into an ideal of regularity. Now the next point is that if relationship is existence, we are going to discover from this that the existence of any identifiable thing or event in the whole cosmos depends upon and in an opposite sense is responsible for the existence of everything else. But to do that, we've got to understand another image, which I will illustrate with the parable of a rainbow. Now, you know there's an old philosophical conundrum. If a tree falls in a forest and there is nobody around to hear it, does it make a noise? This is a very simple problem, but it has been discussed in ways that make it very confusing. A noise is a neurological experience caused by a vibration of air interacting with an eardrum and an auditory nervous system. So therefore, obviously, when the tree falls, it will set up a vibration in the air. But if this vibration in the air does not pulsate upon an eardrum, there will be no noise. You can see it in a simpler way. What will happen if I hit a skinless drum? There will be a hit but no sound, because the drum has no skin. So if there is no eardrum, the vibrations in the air will not make a noise. I don't need to introduce, to prove this, any spookery about mind as distinct from matter or anything like that. It's quite straightforward. But now let's take the somewhat more subtle case of seeing a rainbow. To perceive a rainbow, there must be three variables present, three factors. There must A, be the sun. B, there must be moisture in the atmosphere. And funnily enough, C, there must be an observer at a certain angle relative to the angle of the sun and the moisture. The observer will, in other words, be standing shall we say, on a straight line between the sun and the body of moisture, and what will then appear to be the center of the rainbow. That's why the side of a rainbow is always off to one side. You never see the side of a rainbow directly in front of you. So the position of a rainbow differs for every observer, just in the same way as that the position of this table differs for each one of you in the room. Depends where you're sitting as to where you see it. Now, the trouble with this illustration is that a rainbow is a rather diaphanous thing, and we tend to accord it a rather low reality status. And yet it fulfills all the requirements necessary for a genuinely existent thing. Oh, it's true, you can't grab hold of it. But neither can you grab hold of the moon, at least not yet. Now, it has these criteria. It isn't a hallucination, because everybody standing around will curse and swear, and they see that at such and such a time and place they veritably do see this rainbow. So it's not like a ghost or a hallucination. But everybody sees it in a slightly different place. And you see, if there were no sun shining, there would be no rainbow. If there were no moisture in the atmosphere, there would be no rainbow. But let us suppose that the sun is shining and there is moisture in the atmosphere, but nobody is around. We only say with great reluctance that there would be no rainbow, because that way of looking at things upholds a particular mythology of the world. The world is something independent of us. This is the great superstition of Western culture, that the world is independent of you, that you don't make any difference to it. It's just something into which you come. It's going along and along and along. You come in and you look in the box and say, well, that's the way it is, and then they kick you out again. But now let's set up the situation in another way. Let's suppose the sun is shining out on the ocean somewhere, and I'm on a ship, and I could look over there and I'd say, my goodness, isn't this a nice day? If there was some moisture right over there, we would have a rainbow. And everybody says, well, there isn't one. It just does not truly exist that there is a rainbow. All right, the sun is shining out on the ocean, and there is some moisture. If there were a ship sailing near it so that there could be someone to see, there would be a rainbow. Now, in these two situations, they are both exactly the same. There would be a rainbow if there was some moisture around, but there isn't. And equally, there would be a rainbow if there was someone to see it, and there isn't. Those are two completely equivalent situations. Because this isn't, again, a question of spookery. It's a question that the existence of the phenomenon rainbow depends on the presence of three factors. Like the existence of a human being depends on the existence of two factors, a man and a woman. Everybody has to have a father and a mother, or have had. And otherwise, with the exception of that relationship, you don't exist. Well, now, the case of the rainbow is exactly the same case as everything else. It's just because a rainbow is rather diaphanous and intangible, although it sure hits you in the eye. And the eye, the seeing, is a form of touching. Seeing is touching at a distance. When you find that the table is hard, that is a way of feeling with your fingers the same thing as that you cannot see through it with your eyes. So we are funny about this. Purely optical sensations are regarded as having a lesser grade of reality than tactile sensations. When you get hold of something and can grab it, and you feel it solid, you feel you are surer of its existence than if you merely see it. But it's all the same thing. Touch is a sensation as if your finger ends were full of millions of little eyes. Every nerve end an eye. And they close around this and they find it is not transparent. Here is a limit. Here is something we don't go through. But that's exactly the same as when you see with these eyes here. You don't see through something. So then, the physical world responding to the sense of touch. I mean, it's another way of saying the table would not be hard and is not hard except when touched. It is the touch that evokes the hardness in the table. When it is not touched, it's not soft, it's not hard. It has no quality at all. Nothing which is not in relation to us has any existence, or, I will add, in relation to some other kind of responsive creature. Just in the same way that when light energy goes out of the sun into space, the energy will only be manifested as light if there is some body outside the sun to reflect the light. Otherwise, the light does not in any way illumine the darkness of space. You must bring something into it to manifest the light in space. So a Zen poem says, the tree manifests the bodily power of the wind. The water manifests the spiritual nature of the moon. Because you see, if the wind is blowing, that is to say, an energy is moving along and there is nothing to stand in its way, the energy is not there. The energy in the situation is evoked only by something standing in its way. then it's manifest. The water manifests the spiritual power of the moon. Why? Because in the breaking waves, the moon can be shattered into thousands of fragments, and yet it always remains one. That's its spiritual power. You wouldn't see that miracle of the moon if it weren't for the waves. And they divide it up like that. All right, you can say, it's a distortion. That's not the way the moon is. The waves are not reflecting it correctly. But that's only trying to say that things reflected in a smooth and still surface are reflected more really than things reflected in a vibrating surface. Okay, if you want to construe it that way, it's your privilege. But you can have any kind of reflecting you want. So in the same way, it is with you. What you see, therefore, depends on the way your senses are constructed. You have certain kinds of sense organs, and these sense organs evoke the kind of universe appropriate to them. It's not necessarily the way things are, because there is no way that things are apart from their impact or better relationship with some kind of perceiver or perceiving organism. Because things are only in relation. When there is nothing to which they can relate, nothing is happening. And the so-called existence which we perceive and that to which it is related come into being together. Now, is that to say that before any living organisms existed, there wasn't any universe? Is that to say that all our knowledge of the prehistoric and geological past of the world and the cosmos before life came to it is nothing but an extrapolation? That is to say, all we are saying is that this is what would have been happening if there had been people around to see it. But since there weren't, since there was no living organism around to witness this, nothing was going on. Now, it's possible to make a very good case for that point of view. But I would like to be a little more modest and not make it quite that radical. And I would say rather this. There would never have been a universe before living beings existed unless there was going to be a creature called man. Man living in a future, say, implies in the past a certain state of affairs. In other words, this planet had to come into being with an adequate amount of temperature, oxygen, gases, everything else, food supplies, for the organism called man to exist. So let me say then, the existence of man implies a certain kind of environment, meteorological, geological, and astronomical. But the other side of this proposition is that such an environment implies man. Now, where you get two sides of a situation where they imply each other mutually, you have, in fact, a truly relational and unitary system. Because then, therefore, the answer to this problem is that prior to the existence of any form of life, the universe at that time is dependent upon the fact that those forms of life are going to emerge. Now, this is a thing that is very difficult for us to understand, because we think of reality proceeding forward into the future, but dependent only upon the past. It's very difficult for us to see that events that we call past are dependent upon events in the future. That a lot of things would never started unless certain results were going to happen. Again, this is another of those ideas which is an affront to common sense. But there are a number of ways of showing that it's quite a sensible idea. Unless you were, if you're flying an aeroplane, you leave London, you arrive in New York. You wouldn't have started out from London unless you had known in advance there was a place called New York where you could land. So in a very similar way, the energy system of the universe does not start out with certain, say, very primitive amoebic creatures until it knows that it can arrive. I don't know where it's going on beyond man, but at least it's got to get as far as man. Because if it's not going to be able to do that, it won't even start. Now you can put this in other terms. An electric current. Electricity isn't like water. When you turn on the faucet, the water goes right down the hose and waits at the nozzle. So as soon as you turn on the nozzle, there's the water. But an electric current isn't like that. When you've got two wires, two terminals, positive and negative, and you've got the positive one hitched up, and here's your wire, and you leave the end of that wire just an inch away from the negative terminal, there is no electric current moving. It hasn't flowed down the wire from the positive terminal so that it waits to be ready to jump. The trouble with is that electricity moves so fast we don't see these things. And you can only see it if you do it on a colossal scale. Let's supposing that we had an electric wire that was 300 million miles in length. Now we connect it at the positive end. Nothing at all happens. Connect it at the negative end. So that too can have the positive. See, that's the other terminal. Then immediately the circuit starts. But the circuit of electric current does not start until there is a place for it to arrive. See, that's the point. So in exactly the same way, it makes no difference whether the wire be something that is 180,000 miles and is traversed in 1 second, or whether it's 60 billion miles that will take a somewhat longer time. In either case, the current will not start until the receptor terminal, the minus terminal, is secured. So in this way, I would say, just exactly the same way, life will not start up in a universe to which it really doesn't belong, in which it is can be regarded as nothing more than a stranger. So if you follow that out, you see this, that the whole existence of the universe depends on every individual. It isn't a question of how long you last, that the universe will only last as long as you do. That's not the point. The universe is much bigger than you are, and you are very small, but at this moment it depends on you. The universe is much longer than you are, and you are very short in time, but nevertheless it depends on you. The universe in the future, long after you're dead, will still be depending on the fact that you once existed. The universe in the past, existing long before you were ever thought of, still depends on the fact that one day you would exist. And it depends on each person. So, in other words, there is, in everything that happens, every whole depends on every part. Because you see, in truth, there are no parts of the universe. Parts are an abstract creation. When we think of someone or something as a part, we are quite arbitrarily cutting him off and saying, by convention, we will agree that our skins are our boundary, and therefore, since our skins do not include the whole cosmos, we are only a part of it. But there are no parts. Just as in your own, when you study your own organism, all of it's continuous. All the so-called parts flow into the others like the motions of waves. You don't have detachable parts that you can unscrew inside you, you see? Unless you've got false teeth or something like that, then you take it out, see? But in the ordinary way, you can't unscrew parts of the human being from another. They're continuous. Well, in exactly the same way, you are continuous with this environment. And although we have been habituated to looking upon ourselves as separate things, we are no more separate from what's going on around us than each of these waves here are separate from the ocean. Or that Mount Tamalpais is separate from the planet Earth. We have great freedom of movement, so do the waves. So do the gulls floating in the air. So do the trees waving in the wind. We have a larger degree of freedom than that, because we are more volatile. But we are just as much waves in the total process. It depending upon us, and we in turn depending upon it. Now understand the meaning of there being no parts. All parts are ideas. We have an idea of a part. We chop things up and say one human being, two human beings, three human beings, and so on, and so think of it as parts. But that's not the way it works. You can see this from the most elementary neurology by understanding that it is the way you are as a living body that evokes the kind of universe that you see. It is your body which turns the sun into light, which turns it into heat, which turns water into wet and rocks into hard. And in turn, your body is one of the pulsations of nature along with the sun, the rocks, the water, etc. So there's a mutual arrangement. It creates you, or evokes you, or does you, whatever word you want to use, and at the same moment you do it, and you do all of it. So this is why there was some kind of truth in astrology